Moving your mom or your dad or yourself isn't just about moving things from one place to another. It is much more complicated than that, as are so many things having to do with later life. How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward provides in-depth conversations with professionals, older adults, and their family members who share their stories with warmth, understanding, and humor. I'm your host, Marty Stevens-Heebner, and here you'll find answers to many of your questions, as well as different perspectives that I hope will inform and inspire you. Ken, welcome so much to How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward. I'm very honored that you're here to talk about both your practices.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, you're fantastic. And we've worked together a lot. And your clients think you're wonderful and you are a dream to work with alongside being part of a team with you. Ken Kossoff has been an attorney for over 35 years, and his practice is based in Westlake Village. He's a certified estate planning, probate, and trust law specialist here in California. And I don't hear a lot of people a lot of attorneys having that certification. So that's important. He's very experienced and compassionate when it comes to helping his clients negotiate the labyrinth of legal issues that inevitably arise as people age into their later years. He's been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, Fox Business News, and lots of other media outlets because he's such an expert. Ken is also the co-founder of Solo Aging Solutions, which provides healthcare agents to uphold their clients' healthcare wishes should the need arise. We're going to talk about that a lot more in just a few minutes because it's a very important service and very unique that is offered through Solo Aging Solutions. So Ken, what's your favorite memory of your grandparents?
Well, my favorite memory of one of my grandmothers was when I was probably in my mid-teens. I had an older cousin who had a lot of girlfriends, and I remember my grandmother saying to me, I've told him he needs to make sure his girlfriends take a pill and that it's not an aspirin.
I love her already.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. You also told me about a very difficult memory you had. That was very cool.
My least favorite memory of my same grandmother. And she had been hospitalized and then I'm using terms that I now know. At the time I was maybe 20, maybe 21. She was hospitalized and then discharged to either a rehabilitation facility or a skilled nursing facility. And I went to visit her for it was the first and last time. And when I got there, she just almost was crying and pleading with me to take her out of there. And as a 20 or 21-year-old, I'd never been to a skilled nursing facility before, and I didn't know what to do. I knew I couldn't take her out of there. She was supposed to be there. She needed care. And it was just it was traumatic, quite honestly.
Yeah, at that age, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for talking about that, because it really emphasizes how every generation in a family is impacted when somebody's going through the difficulties that eventually arise with later life.
For a lot of people who have not happy of where they're at in their later lives, they might not really think about the impact that it has on especially their grandchildren or great-grandchildren.
True, and all the more reason to start talking about your own later life sooner rather than later and plan for it.
Yes.
And speaking of planning, what's the focus of your legal work, please?
Well, I do estate planning and what's known as life care planning. Life care planning is a model of practice where you have estate planning attorneys who have either a social worker or a nurse on staff, or both a social worker and a nurse, to assist clients with it.
It's wonderful that you have someone like that on your staff, because very few attorneys do. And you really, I remember asking you about what drew you to this particular field of law. And you said you wanted a more holistic way of approaching people.
Yeah, I remember I was meeting with a husband and a wife, and we were talking about a whole bunch of things relating to incapacity, mortality, all the things people don't want to talk about their children, about their thinking about life, death, healthcare, their kids. And as they were walking out of my office, the husband turned to me and said, by the time this process is over, you're going to know us better than anybody else knows us. And, that made me feel good. And that in so many respects is true. People talk about very intimate thoughts, and I like, I like trying to make sure that their thinking is reflected in their estate planning documents, and that they're not just boilerplate that have nothing to do with them other than their names.
Yeah, and that's not who you are. One of the things that's really remarkable is that you really do show such compassion and empathy. What should people be asking attorneys like you when they're interviewing someone to figure out who should put together their estate plan?
Well, I think some people are just focused on price, and I could understand that. But I think, the real question should be, what's your approach to people in situations like mine, as I've described them to you? Everybody's come to me, and everybody always has a simple estate, no matter how complex it is. They think it's simple. That's just a natural thing to say. And so I think it's really, how do you approach people with, in my situation?
How would somebody describe your approach?
I think my approach is probably more in a more human approach. I mean, I'm not just looking at the legal and tax issues. I'm looking at the human issues involved in dealing with incapacity or death. And so that's why I realize, even if somebody has a ton of money and could afford to have their loved one at home with care for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, life is still going to be very miserable and very difficult. And they need to be prepared for that and understand they're not the first ones who have experienced it, and try and make sure that the caregiving spouse or the caregiving child is not the one who drops dead first because of all the stress involved in having a loved one for whom you're responsible for caring when you've probably never done that before.
Yeah, it's a whole new thing. It's like being the executor of a will. Suddenly, you have to take care of something that you don't know anything about. And it is amazing. The statistic is really frightening of how often caregivers, especially their caregiving spouses, pass away before the person they've been taking care of does, because of what you said, the stress and everything, and the lack of their own care for themselves.
Yeah, and I have seen that with caregiving spouses. I've also seen that with, the 51-year-old son of an 88-year-old father. And one of the things about comparing it to an executor, I heard an attorney once who said, the problem is not when you die, the problem is when you won't die. And so being an executor or being the trustee of a trust is very complex and is very difficult, but in a lot of respects pales in comparison to what you have to deal with if the person you're caring for is incapacitated instead of dead. The most difficult cases are the one where, there's live issues going on. I mean, one of the most horrible things I've experienced is, a 55-year-old diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And, those are very difficult conversations to have with people, with the person and their spouse, and finding out about it and reacting to it. And this was a person who I had known beforehand. But I get a lot of satisfaction of just trying to be with them and walk them through what they're experiencing. So
you're really showing your humanity with them. And I find that when we're working with in my field too, and many others who take care of older adults and their families, it's in a way, it's kind of lovely, because you really, you should be showing your humanity. It makes them more comfortable. And especially at the end of life, I think people really appreciate that. Now, it's interesting with estate planning, you should do a healthcare directive. And in terms of one's healthcare when you're incapacitated and what have you, what you were just talking about too, when people are in a coma or they have dementia or something like that, this is where solo aging solutions can be so helpful. Can you explain why you launched solo aging solutions, and also who it serves and how?
Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, several years ago, 6 years or so now, I brought on a medical social worker onto my staff. And there were a lot of times we would give presentations to senior centers or other groups, or sometimes just meeting with the clients of the firm. And invariably in every presentation we made, especially to a larger group, somebody would raise their hand and they would say, look, I've got somebody who could manage my money. I'm not worried about that. What I don't have is anybody who could manage my health care. Either I don't have children, or, my children aren't functional or live far away, or I don't want to place this burden on them. And as soon as somebody would ask that question, others would chime in and raise their hands and say, we have the same issue.
Wow.
And the reality of the situation is I didn't have a good answer. There are, you can't say friends and family, because if you say friends and family, they wouldn't have been asking the question. There are private fiduciaries, people who act as trustees and executors and conservators for a living. And some private fiduciaries, lots of private fiduciaries actually, will act as an agent under a healthcare directive as the price they need to pay in order to manage the money, where their skills and also revenue primarily comes from.
Yeah.
And some of them have told me they don't like doing it. Others have told me they don't think they do it very well.
I mean, literally, when you are the healthcare agent, you literally have people's lives in your hands.
Yes. And a lot of us just conceive of that as, you get a call at 4 a.m, your loved one had a stroke, we're either going to give life support or not, what do we do? But it's also, if the person can't make decisions for themselves, they need to make changes in medication, they need to get authorization to change medication, to make other medical decisions as to what care to give them short of life support, or, what care to withhold or withdraw. So it was because we didn't have a good answer to that question, and I felt bad that we created Solo Aging Solutions. And Solo Aging Solutions is intended to fill that gap where we will act as agents under a healthcare directive. We will not manage money. If people ask us to manage money, the answer is no, that's not what we do. We do only healthcare decision making. And we have to do it in two ways. Number one, it's to make sure that the client's desires are known on a current basis, that their healthcare conditions and prognosis are known on a current basis. And the reason why we need to know all that is because our personnel need to feel comfortable with this enormous decision, this position of huge responsibility, life and death, that they now have in their hands. So, my business partner, Katie Wiltfong, who's the medical social worker, joined me a number of years ago at my firm. What we need to do is to make sure that we're comfortable and current. And that's why we established the protocol where, we have multiple communications with our clients on a regular basis.
That's extraordinary. And what kind of training do your healthcare agents go through to qualify?
Well, Katie is a medical social worker who has more than a decade in hospice. So she's been dealing with life and death for a good period of time. One of the things I have told people over the years is, Katie could walk into a facility and judge whether the smell is due to the fact that this is just the way some facilities smell because they're in the healthcare business, or that there's a hygiene problem. So, it's just, you have to feel comfortable with the issues. You have to feel comfortable with the places where our clients are going to be. And we have to feel comfortable that we know what our clients would want and not want in these circumstances.
Yeah. Well, and also possess that knowledge. What kind of people are you would you hire as healthcare agents? What would be their ideal background?
I think their ideal background is probably a hospice background, because people in the hospice field, this is what they do. They help people transition from life to death and to die peacefully and as little pain as possible. So I think that's a very good, I don't necessarily know perfect, but that's about as good a background as you could have.
And also they're comfortable with the medical issues and things like that. They're well aware of how medications work, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And also because sometimes hospice comes in and the people pass away 2 days later.
That happened to my dad. That happened to my father. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. A lot of times they're in there for weeks or months on end. And if the patient is not able to give direction on their healthcare, they're very familiar with having to call the agent under the healthcare directive. Because again, it's not just a situation where you get the call at 4 a.m. to pull the plug. It's all the steps leading to that over the days or weeks or months before somebody passes away.
Yeah. Well, and suppose somebody's in a horrible car accident and they're unconscious and their leg is badly injured, and the doctor says, "Well, we may need to amputate." Somebody who's an expert like that and understands the whole background of how it will affect the rest of their lives can make a knowledgeable decision. You're thinking about it and who the patient is, and also listen to what the doctor is explaining, what the exact injuries are, to determine if that's really necessary to make that decision for the client.
Right. And also, is that only going to impact their leg, or has their head been injured too? Is there a brain injury? So, that's, I think, what a lot of clients, there's probably a lot of people out there who would say, okay, if my leg has to be amputated, that's fine if I'm otherwise functional mentally.
Yeah.
And maybe otherwise functional physically. But on the other hand, I remember a few years ago, a client came in and was talking about how the doctors had said, we need to save to let your loved one continue to live, we need to amputate all 4 limbs. And the person said, how much longer will that give my loved one? And the doctor said, 2 weeks. And it was like, why would they even mention that? It's like, that's not an alternative. That didn't make sense, at least in my opinion, and certainly in their opinion, because they said no. Let them go.
When should someone consider engaging a healthcare agent at Solo Aging Solutions?
Well, I think when you're capable of instructing us on what you want to do or what you would want done in these circumstances, if somebody is already demented or otherwise unable to communicate to us what their desires would be, that probably means that they cannot sign a healthcare directive. Biggest surprise to us from the perspective of when we first started and how we saw our demographic is that we had a couple of referrals from attorneys of single men both of whom were 47 years old, total unrelated to each other. And they were just unmarried, no children, did not want their parents involved. It's when people realize that, they don't have anybody to make the decisions, and they want the peace of mind to know that they do have somebody to make the decisions if they want to participate in our program. And for some people, we are just, we are number 2 instead of number 1, again, behind the kids. But if the kids can't get here, because even, for the kid who lives on the East Coast, prior to, March of 2020, everybody figured you could just hop on an airplane and come out. And then we learned that maybe that's not guaranteed in the future. So we're the localized ears. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's so true. I love that you can kind of be the backup if somebody can't be there. That's wonderful. I didn't know that. So I'm glad I know that now.
Yeah. And we're also, the kid is most likely going to be leaning on us heavily to try and understand what's going on and to tap into the background of our healthcare agents, because the adult child, unless they're in the healthcare field, probably doesn't have the background. Yeah, right now we are focused in Southern California, and with plans to expand elsewhere, hopefully in the not too distant future. Yeah.
So let's talk about a healthcare directive. Because if someone doesn't have one, I do, they may not know what goes into it. They may be a little nervous about really, going and answering all the questions. What kind of things go into a healthcare directive?
Well, in a healthcare directive, the first thing you're doing is appointing somebody to make decisions for you if you cannot make those decisions on your own. I mean, it is possible to give somebody immediate authority, but most people do not unless they're older or have a terminal illness. Then they're pretty confident they're not going to be able to make their own decisions for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
But, so you're appointing somebody, you're hopefully appointing an alternative if that person cannot serve, maybe 2 alternatives. And then you're trying to give them directions on what your thinking is. Basically, you're basically saying, if I'm in an irreversible condition from which death is expected in some period of time, what would I want? And you could get more particular if you'd like to. You could talk about some of the things that often are not in healthcare directives and are in what are known as PULSE, physician orders for life-sustaining treatments, which are a different document. I was giving a presentation on healthcare directives once with a nurse, and she said in her healthcare directive, it says you could put a feeding tube in me for 10 days if I'm not ready to feed myself after that, just pull it out and let me go. And what you're trying to do, regardless of what's written down, is you want to have conversations on a semi-regular basis with the agents under your healthcare directive. Because what I tell clients is that you never want somebody thinking, am I, going to let my mother die today? You want them thinking, mom can talk. I know exactly what she would want in this situation. I'm just her spokesperson. I'm just expressing what she would say if she were in this position. So I'm not making any decisions. She made the decisions when she told me and instructed me on what she would want and what she would not want. So it's still enormous responsibility that weighs heavily in the minds of the person making the decision.
Especially if you're family or just a very dear friend or a spouse, a partner. Let's go back to estate planning. It's really not just about a will. I think that's what people think it is. And so they download something from one of those online places and just figure, oh, I got a will. I'm done. I'm good. Not a good idea. Let the expert Ken explain it to you.
Okay. So, the first thing is if you're going in for estate planning, what you want is a comprehensive estate plan. If you're going to use a will, and not use a trust, and that's a discussion you have with your attorney, that's fine, but a will is effective only after you die. So it does nothing during incapacity. It doesn't authorize anybody to manage your affairs while you're incapacitated. So the question is, how's that going to happen? I think for my clients, I want their documents to express their views, not just the legal stuff that lawyers want to see in there, but the views of the clients. And sometimes, clients should write out separate instructions or letters to their family. If we write if some lawyer writes a boring legal document, if somebody's trying to remember their father who died 3 days ago, they're not going to sit there reading his trust. But if the father wrote a letter telling how much he loved his children and grandchildren and, maybe some lessons, and working on one right now where the client sort of has a message to a judge if there's ever a dispute, where he basically said, I know that, sometimes at least one side is upset with the resolution of litigation, if not both sides. And if my family's going to fight over my estate, judge, I would like you to come up with a decision that pisses both sides off. Because if they're going to fight about my estate, they should be upset, because I'll be upset. And if I can do anything about it in the afterlife, I will. Even when I do that, it's still boilerplate. It's important legal stuff in there, but it's boilerplate. But I like the client's family being able to look at the document and say, oh, this is the exact kind of thing that my father would have said. As I tell people, the only thing I know for certain is something's going to happen that we don't anticipate. And if it's addressed in the trust document, then it makes it easier to deal with and less likely to, require judicial intervention or something along those lines. I had a client once who, came to me when there was a dispute with his sibling over his mother's trust. And he previously told me how proud he was that through his efforts, his mother's trust was a lot shorter than all these long documents that most lawyers draw. And unfortunately for him, it was missing one paragraph that would have resolved the issue. And instead, he litigated with his sibling for a considerable period of time. And if one boilerplate paragraph had been in there, it would have been too late for the sibling to do anything.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And that's why they come to attorneys like you who are smart and know how to express why something needs to be there. And it's ridiculous because I hate to think how much money they spent on all the legal fees that otherwise would have gone to them or whomever were the beneficiaries.
Yeah. It's amazing how much people will spend. Just the way I explained it is, you broke my G.I. Joe when I was 6 and you were 8, and we're now 66 and 68, but I'm going to get back at you for that. And that's sort of the way it happens.
And it's such misplaced anger because it's really, it's the bigger issue is the grief, and it's just being expressed in a very odd way. Or like you say, they have this old grudge or something.
Yeah. Deep-seated psychological issues with siblings. Yeah.
Go buy yourself another G.I. Joe is what I'd say to that person.
Yeah.
One last thing I've heard, and actually my father put both my sister and I on his healthcare directive. We don't have a great relationship, and I was just relieved because we did agree on what to do. But it's really not a wise idea to have multiple parties on healthcare directives and as executors and trustees. Am I correct in that?
Well, I think it's less wise to do it on healthcare directives than as trustees. And the reason I say that is because let's say you have 3 children and you say, I want my 3 children to be my decision makers under my healthcare directive, and it's majority rule. And 2 of them say effectively pull the plug, and 1 says don't pull the plug. What I would expect the hospital to say for risk management purposes is go get a court order, because they're not going to want to pull the plug on the majority rule because they're afraid that the dissenter is going to sue them. So, that's why I fear having more than one healthcare decision maker. Some people still insist on it, and that is certainly their prerogative. And if it creates problems, they understand that. But I'm more cautious about doing that with healthcare directives than I am about doing that with trusts. But one of the things you can do in a healthcare directive, if you have an attorney and the attorney signs a particular affidavit saying that he or she advised you, is you could exclude people from interfering with your healthcare decision. So if you have family members or friends, or you're concerned about some public agency that's specified in the probate code, the public guardian, you could list those people and effectively say they do not have standing in court to sue concerning your healthcare directive and the acts that your agents are taking or declining to take.
If a divorce isn't final and there's a spouse legally still hanging out there somewhere who wants to interfere, that's very important. I'm glad you shared that. Thank you.
Yeah, because most likely your spouse would want to kill you before you need it. Yeah.
All the more reason not to have them interfering with your healthcare.
Yeah.
Ken, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me, because all of that information was so helpful. You're a wonderful estate planning attorney and also solo aging solutions. It's a unique service that's offered, and it's just wonderful. Thank you so much for being with me.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to How to Move Your Mom and Still Be on Speaking Terms Afterward. Please visit howtomoveyourmom.com for more information about this episode and for additional podcast episodes featuring other extraordinary guests and conversations. Until next time, this is your very grateful host, Marty Stevens-Huebner.